Officer Sanchez stomped on my hand in the chow line and said, "Did I say you could effing eat?" When I tried to stand up for myself, he pressed a baton to my throat and said, "You'll be begging for a fix by tomorrow." I stayed silent. That was 16 months ago. This morning, he was led into court in shackles and wouldn't stop staring at me. I showed up at Central State Correctional with fake needle marks and hair that reeked of cigarette smoke. My officer walked me through while I twitched behind him, playing the part of a strung-out junkie perfectly. The intake officer barely looked at me. "Another tweaker," he muttered, shoving the orange jumpsuit across the counter. Cell Block D, the infamous block where 14 young inmates had died in 6 months, all ruled as sewer slides or overdoses. There was just one rule I had to follow. Don't let them get to the FBI wire sewn into my shoes. Officer Sanchez grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "Junkies always cause problems," he announced to the other guards. "This one's already shaking." Perfect. The tremors would cover for any nervousness while I documented how inmates kept dying on their watch. The processing room reeked of bleach and desperation. Officer Sanchez shoved me against the wall for the strip search, laughing when I stumbled. "Can't even stand straight," he said. "How long before this one's in withdrawal?" Officer Kent joined him, both treating me like I was contagious. "Put him in the junkie cell," Kent said. "Let Lamar deal with another mouth to feed." They assigned me to D Block's worst cell, a concrete box with mysterious stains on the walls. My cellmate Carlos whispered that the last 3 people in this bunk hadn't lasted a month. "They OD'd," he said, making air quotes, "but they weren't even users." At dinner, the guards made their priorities clear. While general population got real trays, D Block inmates got whatever was left. Officer Sanchez walked the line, kicking trays when inmates reached for them. "Junkies don't deserve hot food," he announced. When I tried to grab a piece of bread, he stomped on my hand. "Did I say you could effing eat?" The wire in my shoe recorded every word. The next morning revealed the real operation. During count, Sanchez and Kent pulled 2 inmates from their cells. "Medical evaluation," they announced. But through the bars, I watched them lead the men to a storage room, not the infirmary. Screams echoed for 20 minutes before silence. At lunch, those bunks were empty. "Heart attacks," Sanchez told everyone. "Substances are dangerous." It was clear that they were targeting the vulnerable. Addicts with no family, mentally ill inmates, anyone who wouldn't be missed. Sanchez made a game of denying medication. "You want your methadone?" he'd ask, holding the cup just out of reach. "Beg for it." When inmates collapsed from withdrawal, he'd step over them. "Natural selection," he'd say. Officer Kent was worse. He'd visit cells after lights out, flashlight in one hand, baton in the other. "Bed check," he'd announce, but we all knew better. He'd pick an inmate, always the weakest ones, and drag them out. They'd return hours later, bruised and silent. Some never returned at all. On day 4, they escalated with me. Sanchez noticed I wasn't showing severe withdrawal symptoms. "You're faking," he accused during the morning count. He yanked me from my cell and threw me against the wall. "Think you're smart? Think you're better than the other junkies?" He pressed his baton against my throat. "I've seen 100 like you. You'll be begging for a fix by tomorrow." They put me on Sewer Slide Watch, their favorite cover story. Stripped to boxers in a freezing cell with a camera that conveniently malfunctioned whenever guards visited. Kent brought in Officer Davis, a mountain of a man who enjoyed his work too much. "This one thinks he's tough," Sanchez told him. "Show him what happens to tough guys in D Block." Davis grabbed my hair and slammed my face into the concrete wall. "Where's your stash?" he demanded. When I mumbled I didn't have one, he laughed. "They all say that." He kicked my ribs, each blow calculated to hurt but not leave obvious marks. "By tomorrow, you'll be begging to tell us everything." That night, they demonstrated their system. An inmate named Tommy, barely 18 and actually detoxing, started seizing in his cell. Instead of calling medical, Sanchez and Kent watched through the bars. "Taking bets on how long he lasts," Sanchez said. They let him convulse for 15 minutes before Kent finally went in, not to help, but to plant a baggie in his pocket. "Another overdose," he announced. Shame he couldn't kick the habit. They were getting bolder, cockier. Sanchez started bragging during shift changes. "Cleaning up the streets, one junkie at a time," he'd say. "Governor should give us a medal." Kent kept a tally on his locker, hash marks for each overdose on his watch. 23 marks when I counted. On day 6, they decided I was next. Sanchez pulled me into the storage room where those screams had come from. Syringes lined the wall. "Know what's funny about junkies?" he asked, filling a needle with something clear. "They'll shoot up anything, even if they don't want to." Kent held me down while Sanchez approached with the needle. "Another tragic overdose," he practiced. If only he'd accepted help. That's when the doors burst open and FBI agents flooded in. Someone had told them about a corrupt prison officer. The door exploded off its hinges as 6 FBI agents rushed in with rifles raised. Sanchez's hand froze inches from my arm, the needle still dripping that clear liquid. His face went white as Agent Vasquez stepped through the doorway with her badge held high. Kent dropped his grip on my shoulders and backed against the wall. The syringe fell from Sanchez's hand and shattered on the concrete floor. More agents poured in behind Vasquez, their tactical gear making them look like an army. Sanchez made a desperate grab for the broken syringe, but I kicked it away. He lunged at me anyway, trying to scratch me with the broken glass. 2 agents tackled him before he could reach me. Kent tried to run, but slammed into another agent in the doorway. They had him on the ground in seconds with his arms twisted twisted behind his back. The storage room filled with more agents and prison officials who had no idea what was happening. Sanchez kept screaming that I was just another junkie while they cuffed him. The needle had left a red scratch on my arm where it grazed me. Vasquez pulled me aside and checked the wound while other agents started bagging the syringes on the wall. Prison alarms started blaring as word spread that federal agents were arresting guards. Through the doorway, I could see inmates pressing against their cell bars trying to figure out what was going on. Two paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, and Vasquez told them I needed immediate medical attention for a possible overdose. They loaded me up while I pretended to be barely conscious. As they wheeled me out, I saw Davis trying to blend in with the other guards, but two agents grabbed him. The hallway was chaos with guards running everywhere and inmates shouting from their cells. In the medical wing, they hooked me up to monitors and started an IV while a doctor checked my vitals. Through the window, I watched agents leading Sanchez, Kent, and Davis out in handcuffs. Other guards stood around looking scared, probably wondering if they were next. The doctor tested what was left in the broken syringe, and his face went pale. He told the nurse it was pure fentanyl, enough to kill someone instantly. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing shallow to maintain my cover. After an hour, the medical staff left me alone, and I finally let my hands stop shaking. My whole body ached from 6 days of beatings and barely eating. Vasquez came in with transfer paperwork, telling the doctor I was being moved to a federal facility for my own safety. We walked through D Block one last time, and every inmate was watching. Tommy was standing at his cell door, still weak from his seizure 3 days ago. He stared at me like he knew something was different. Carlos gave me a small nod from our old cell. As we passed, Tommy grabbed the bars and asked if I was coming back. I couldn't answer without blowing my cover, but Vasquez spoke up and said I did what I had to do. The other inmates started whispering, and I could feel them putting the pieces together. 3 hours later, I sat in an FBI conference room pulling off my shoes with the wire sewn inside. My hands shook as I handed them over to the evidence team. They had recorded everything for 6 days straight. Vasquez showed me a board with photos of 23 inmates who had died in the past year. Each face stared back at me, young men who never made it out. She told me the recordings would get justice for all of them. I kept thinking about Tommy still inside, wondering who would protect him now. The evidence team started reviewing the recordings and found more than we expected. Bank records showed Sanchez and Kent were depositing thousands in cash every month. They were selling the drugs they claimed inmates had overdosed on. Every death certificate had Warden Blackwood's signature without any real investigation. The FBI expanded the case to include the warden and started pulling financial records, but I worried about the inmates still inside with no one watching out for them. 2 days later, I couldn't sleep in the safe house they put me in. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tommy shaking on the floor while guards laughed. Vasquez called to tell me they moved Tommy and 12 other vulnerable inmates to protective custody. Carlos was helping investigators identify which deaths were suspicious. The Wire had recorded 47 hours of clear evidence, including guards discussing their crimes, but 23 inmates were already dead and nothing would bring them back. The story broke on the news, but they kept my identity secret. Reporters called it Operation D Block and focused on the guard corruption. Families started coming forward with stories about their dead sons and brothers. One mother held up a photo of her 19-year-old son who had never used drugs before going to prison. What an incredible undercover operation. I can't believe how dangerous it was with fake needle marks and pretending to be an addict, while guards like Sanchez and Kent were actually killing inmates. He was one of the hash marks on Kent's locker. She cried as she told reporters he had anxiety, and the guards targeted him for being weak. More families came forward saying their loved ones died within weeks of arriving at Central. A week into the investigation, federal prosecutors took over the case. They assigned a whole team to go through the evidence and build charges. They wanted me to testify, but needed to keep me safe since other guards might want revenge. 3 guards from Central came forward saying they saw suspicious deaths, but were too scared to report them. One guard said he watched Kent drag an inmate to the storage room and the kid never came back. Another said Sanchez bragged about cleaning up the streets one junkie at a time. Davis's lawyer was already claiming his client was just following orders from senior officers. The next day, Vasquez called me at the safe house with news that made my stomach drop. She'd found records showing Officer Sanchez had worked at 2 other prisons before Central, and both places had spikes in inmate deaths during his time there. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't just about Central, it was bigger than we thought. My phone buzzed while she was talking, and I saw Carlos's name on the screen. He was still inside Central waiting for his appeal hearing, and said the whole place had changed overnight. Guards who weren't arrested were walking on eggshells, scared they'd be next, while some inmates were getting bold and talking about payback against anyone in uniform. The power balance had flipped, and things were getting dangerous for everyone still locked up. 2 days later, the FBI tech team cracked into Officer Kent's personal locker and found a hidden phone tucked behind his spare uniform. What they discovered on it made even the hardened agents go quiet. Videos, dozens of them, trophies of what they'd done. The first one showed a kid named Miguel, maybe 19 years old, crying and begging while Kent held him down and forced a needle into his arm. Another video had Sanchez teaching Davis exactly exactly where to inject to make it look like the person did it themselves, pointing at veins while laughing about how easy it was to fool the coroner. I watched 3 minutes before I had to run to the bathroom and throw up. The evidence was perfect for court, but seeing those kids' faces, hearing their voices, knowing I'd been sleeping 50 feet away while this happened, it broke something inside me that I still can't fix. A week later, I sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Huang in her office downtown, going over every detail for the third time. She was sharp and thorough, but her face stayed grim as she showed me the defense motions. Sanchez's lawyer was claiming I'd entrapped them, that I'd encouraged the violence to advance my FBI career. The wire recordings proved that was garbage, but Huang warned me they'd try to destroy my credibility on the stand. She showed me page after page of their strategy, painting me as a liar who'd do anything for a promotion. The wire was our strongest evidence, but I could see this fight was just starting. Carlos got released 2 weeks after the arrests, when a judge reviewed his case and found problems with his original conviction. He showed up at my safe house looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. His hands shook as he pulled out a worn notebook filled with names and dates. 43 names of inmates who'd died suspicious deaths while he was inside, each one written in his careful handwriting with details about how it happened. He told me the worst part wasn't the fear of dying, but knowing it was happening and being completely powerless to stop it. The notebook was evidence now, but for him, it was a list of ghosts. Meanwhile, Warden Blackwood announced his resignation, claiming he knew nothing about what his officers were doing. The FBI wasn't buying it and got a warrant for his office the same day. They found his paper shredder running hot with strips of documents still warm in the bin. A forensic team started the slow work of putting those strips back together while families of dead inmates demanded his arrest. The prison guard union released a statement calling Sanchez and Kent good officers who were being railroaded, and other guards at Central started getting anonymous threats. The whole system was eating itself. 3 weeks in, the FBI made me attend mandatory counseling with their psychologist. She asked about my emotional state during deep cover, about how I was processing the trauma. I couldn't explain the weight of it. Watching Tommy Walsh seize on that cold floor for 15 minutes, eating my meals while others went hungry, staying quiet while men died around me. She prescribed sleeping pills, but they didn't stop the dreams where I was back in that cell, and the wire didn't work, and nobody came to save us. A month after the arrests, Vasquez arranged a meeting between me and Linda Walsh, Tommy's mother. We met at a secure hotel conference room, and she broke down the moment she saw me. She grabbed my hands and thanked me over and over for saving her son's life. Tommy was in rehab now, clean for the first time in years, testifying via video link about what happened to him. His testimony about the seizure and the planted drugs would be crucial for the case. Linda kept saying he was just a kid who made mistakes, and they would have killed him if I hadn't been there. I didn't tell her how close it came. The forensic team working on Blackwood's shredded documents called with a breakthrough 6 weeks after the arrests. They'd pieced together bank statements showing the warden got $2,000 for every overdose death in D Block. The money came from a medical supply company that turned out to be owned by Officer Kent's brother-in-law. They were billing the state for addiction treatment and overdose prevention supplies while murdering the inmates who needed that help. The company had contracts with 5 other prisons, and the FBI expanded their investigation to all of them. 2 months in, the defense attorneys filed motions to throw out the wire recordings. They claimed I didn't have proper warrants for some conversations, that I'd violated their clients' privacy rights. Judge Patricia Reeves scheduled hearings, and Huang stayed confident, but warned me about the defense attorney Mitchell Graves. He'd gotten 3 dirty cops acquitted in the last 5 years and knew every trick. She said he'd make me the villain of the story, that I should prepare for character assassination on the stand. The motions were just the beginning of their strategy to flip everything around. I finally went to see my mother 10 weeks after getting out of Central. She'd seen the news coverage and recognized the timeline matched when I'd told her I was traveling for work. Her hands shook as she made coffee and asked me why I didn't tell her what I was really doing. She kept saying I could have died, that any of those days I could have just disappeared, and she'd never know what happened. I couldn't tell her about the storage room, about the syringe pointed at my arm, about how Officer Kent's finger was on the plunger when the FBI burst in. 6 weeks later, Carlos sat in front of the grand jury with his notebook spread open on the table. He'd kept records for 3 years, names and dates of every inmate who died in D Block. Miguel Rodriguez on January 3rd, James Park on February 19th, Anthony Williams on March 7th, 17 names total. The prosecutor showed photos of each victim while Carlos described their last days. How Miguel begged for his seizure meds, how James collapsed from untreated diabetes, how Anthony screamed for help for 2 hours before going silent. 5 other former D Block inmates testified after Carlos, each confirming the pattern. The grand jury took 40 minutes to indict. That same week, Sanchez's wife went on the local news claiming her husband was being framed. She'd started a GoFundMe that raised $12,000 in 2 days. The reporter nodded sympathetically as she cried about their 3 kids needing their father. Then, the station aired Tommy's video testimony. The security footage showed him seizing on the cell floor while Sanchez and Kent stood outside laughing. Kent checked his watch. Sanchez counted money. They made bets on how long Tommy would last. After 15 minutes, Kent finally entered the cell, not to help, but to plant drugs in Tommy's pocket. The GoFundMe disappeared within an hour. The pre-trial hearing came 3 weeks later. Defense attorney Graves put me on the stand and immediately attacked my credibility. He showed the jury photos from my FBI training, clean-cut and professional, then photos from my undercover prep, unwashed and twitching. He asked which version was real. He called me an actor who fooled everyone in the prison. He suggested maybe I was fooling everyone now too. The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. I saw doubt in some jurors' eyes. That afternoon, a nurse from Central named Maria Rodriguez contacted the FBI. She'd been copying medical records for months, hiding them in her car. The records showed every inmate who supposedly overdosed had tested clean just days before dying. She'd reported the pattern to Warden Blackwood 6 times. Each time he told her to mind her own business or find another job. Her evidence connected 23 deaths to the same pattern. 3 months into the case, I couldn't eat without throwing up. I'd lost 15 pounds and my hands shook constantly. Vasquez ordered me to take a week off, but I spent it reviewing victim files instead. Miguel Rodriguez was 19 with a baby daughter. James Park was 22 and had just gotten his GED. Anthony Williams was 24 and wrote poetry his mother still keeps. Their families had blamed them for overdosing instead of the guards who killed them. The prosecution dropped their biggest news at the next hearing. The way Carlos kept that notebook with all 43 names hit so hard, his shaking hands pulling out those pages while he shares each person who died. Miguel Rodriguez, James Park, Anthony Williams, makes this so real and heartbreaking. Officer Davis had flipped. In exchange for 5 years instead of life, he detailed everything. How Sanchez recruited him with promises of easy overtime. How they identified inmates without family connections. How they viewed it as cleaning up society's trash. Davis genuinely believed they were doing good work. The dehumanization went so deep, he still called the victims junkies, even while confessing to killing them. Week 13, I finally went to therapy. Dr. Brennan asked about the storage room and I told her about the needle. How Sanchez's hand was steady. How Kent held me down like I weighed nothing. How I kept thinking everyone would believe I was just another dead junkie. The tremors I'd faked for my cover had become real. My body remembered the fear even when my mind tried to forget. Tommy testified at the preliminary hearing 2 weeks later. He'd been clean for 2 months and gained 20 pounds. He described the starvation tactics, how guards withheld food for days, the medication denials that triggered seizures, the psychological games where they'd promise help, then laugh when inmates believed them. When the judge asked why he never reported it, Tommy just stared at him. The guards were the authorities. Who was he supposed to tell? His testimony shifted the whole narrative from bad apples to systemic rot. Then, investigators found Sanchez's second phone hidden in his garage ceiling. The phone contained messages with guards from 4 other prisons. They shared techniques for making deaths look natural. They compared body counts like sports scores. They had a whole network across 5 states. The FBI task force expanded overnight. We hadn't stopped an isolated incident. We'd stumbled into something massive. 3 days later, Vasquez handed me a letter from Linda, Tommy's mother. She wrote that Tommy had started community college and was studying addiction counseling. She thanked me for saving her son's life, but her gratitude came with rage about all the mothers who never got that chance. The mothers who buried their sons believing they'd overdosed. The mothers who blamed themselves for not helping their kids get clean when their kids were murdered for being sick. 4 months into the legal process, the FBI finally arrested Warden Blackwood at his country club during his weekly golf game. The agents waited until he was putting on the 9th hole before moving in. His arrest photo showed a completely different man than the one who'd run Central with an iron fist. His face looked hollow, and his expensive suit hung loose on his frame. The federal prosecutor charged him with conspiracy and racketeering after forensic accountants traced payments from the guard union directly to his offshore accounts. Guards throughout the California prison system started calling in sick and requesting transfers. The news coverage ran non-stop for 3 days with reporters camping outside Central's gates. 2 weeks later, Vasquez showed up at my apartment with 3 FBI agents and told me to pack immediately. Someone had posted my real name and address on a corrections officer forum with the caption, "Rat who destroyed good men." The death threats started within hours. Moving to the safe house felt like going undercover again, except this time I was hiding from prison guards instead of pretending to be an addict. The new place had bulletproof glass and panic buttons in every room. Former inmates sent thank you letters through the FBI, while guards' families sent photos of their kids with messages about destroying their lives. During discovery proceedings, the defense attorney Graves got access to all our video evidence, including the hidden camera footage from D-Block. Within 48 hours, he'd leaked edited clips to conservative news outlets showing inmates fighting and appearing high. The footage made it look like the guards were dealing with violent animals instead of sick people. Huang objected immediately, but the judge said the videos were already public. The damage was done, and social media filled with people defending the guards as heroes, protecting society. 3 days later, Carlos called me from outside the courthouse sounding scared. 2 men had been following him since the hearing. Before Before he could get to his car, they jumped him claiming their brother was a guard at Central. They broke 3 of his ribs and gave him a concussion before courthouse security arrived. The FBI arrested both attackers and found text messages linking them to the prison guard union's leadership. The union had put out word that witnesses needed to be taught lessons. I drove to the hospital as soon as they'd let me leave the safe house with my security detail. Carlos looked small in the hospital bed with bandages wrapped around his chest. His eyes were swollen shut, but he grabbed my hand when I sat down. I asked if he would do it again, knowing what would happen. He squeezed harder and said those guards killed his friends, and he'd testify every time. His certainty helped with my own doubts about whether justice was worth all this pain. Week 17 brought a major victory when the judge ruled our wire recordings were fully admissible as evidence, but she also allowed the defense to present what she called character evidence about the victims. Their criminal records and addiction histories and mental health problems would all be fair game. Huang argued this was victim blaming, but the judge insisted the jury needed complete context to make their decision. The dead inmates would be on trial alongside their killers. Month 5 found me in a bland conference room with 6 other undercover agents who'd testified in major corruption cases. They shared stories about death threats that lasted years, and character assassination campaigns, and PTSD that never went away. One agent hadn't used his real name in public for 3 years after testifying. Another moved his family 4 times when people kept finding them. The operation ends, but you never really leave cover, according to the agent who'd exposed police corruption in Chicago. This was my future now, and we all knew it. The leaked videos hit Tommy the hardest, since seeing himself on the ground seizing triggered all his trauma. His mother Linda called me crying because he'd relapsed after 8 months clean. The defense would use this against him, calling him an unreliable junkie who couldn't stay sober. Graves immediately filed a motion questioning Tommy's competency to testify as a witness. I connected them with a trauma specialist who worked with witnesses, but the damage was already done. Tommy would have to explain his relapse on the stand, while Graves painted him as another worthless addict. 2 days before the next hearing, a janitor at Central called the FBI about something he'd found while deep cleaning the storage room. Behind a loose panel was a metal box containing a leather journal filled with Kent's handwriting. The journal wasn't just hash marks, but detailed records of every murder going back 3 years. Names and dates and methods and amounts of money received for each death. 57 names total when we counted them all. We'd only known about 14 deaths in 6 months, but this had been happening for years. Kent had kept it as insurance against Sanchez in case things went bad. Each entry included who paid for the hit and why the inmate was selected and how much the guards split. The journal would destroy any claim that these were mercy killings or accidents. Dr. Brennan asked about my survivor's guilt during our mandated therapy session the next week. I kept thinking about being the one with the wire while 57 people died without anyone listening. She reminded me that acting without evidence would have accomplished nothing but getting me killed too. Logic didn't help with the weight of those names though. Each person had a moment like mine in that storage room, but nobody came to save them. 6 months later, I sat in the courthouse watching the prosecutor fight to keep cops off the jury. The defense lawyer wanted people who trusted badges more than evidence. They spent 2 weeks checking social media profiles and running background checks on potential jurors. The prosecutor rejected anyone who had family in law enforcement. The defense kicked out anyone with arrest records or bad experiences with police. Finally, 12 people sat in the box, ready to decide if wearing a uniform made murder okay. Between court sessions, I tried to act normal, but kept seeing danger everywhere. I went running in the mornings, but checked every car that passed me twice. I tried going on a date, but couldn't explain why 2 agents sat at the next table. The FBI said the operation was over, but I still felt like I was undercover in my own life. Maria the nurse took the stand with boxes of medical files and toxicology reports. She showed the jury how the official causes of death were impossible based on the evidence. The defense lawyer attacked her accent and asked about her immigration status. She stayed calm and kept repeating that these men were murdered based on medical facts. During a break, Sanchez caught my eye from across the courtroom and mouthed the words clearly. Security grabbed him, but the message was sent. That night, a brick crashed through my mom's window with a note taped to it about snitches and families. The FBI moved her to a safe house within 2 hours. Tommy looked different when he came back to testify after getting clean. He'd gained weight and his skin wasn't gray anymore, but his hands shook when he talked about the seizure. The whole courtroom went quiet when he described thinking he was dying while the guards laughed. Even the defense lawyer seemed uncomfortable before starting to question Tommy's drug history. The forensic accountant showed the jury spreadsheets tracking every dollar the warden made from deaths. Each murder generated kickbacks from the medical supply company that provided the drugs. Finding Kent's journal with 57 names completely changes everything. Those detailed murder records going back 3 years prove this wasn't just a few bad guards, but a whole killing operation that nobody stopped. The warden got $14,000 for every overdose in D Block. Human lives turned into profit margins on a screen. Vasquez met me at a coffee shop to suggest witness protection after the trial ended. ended. She talked about new names and new cities like it was just another undercover job. I thought about never seeing my family without looking over my shoulder first. She meant it as encouragement when she said I'd already proven I could disappear. But I went undercover to save lives, not to lose my own identity forever. Davis took the stand and showed the jury exactly how to inject someone against their will. He used a mannequin to demonstrate the angle needed to make it look self-inflicted. Several family members left when he explained how to hold someone down without leaving defensive marks. His calm description of murder as standard procedure made the jury look sick. The defense brought in guards who called Sanchez and Kent dedicated officers dealing with violent inmates. They showed statistics about prison attacks and drug problems to paint them as heroes. Then they played pieces of my wire recordings edited to sound like I was encouraging fights. The clips were out of context, but sounded bad without the full conversations around them. Carlos broke down crying when he named the 3 cellmates who died before I arrived. David Smith lasted 2 weeks before his overdose in the same bunk I slept in. Marcus Brown made it 3 weeks before his heart attack at age 22. Jesse Taylor survived 18 days before hanging himself with sheets that weren't there when count started. Carlos said he tried to protect them, but couldn't fight the guards alone. 8 months later, the defense lawyer Graves dragged me back to the witness stand for 3 straight days of attacks on everything about me. He pulled out photos from my other undercover jobs, spreading them across the jury box like playing cards. He pointed at each one, asking the same question over and over about which person I really was. The jury stared at me differently now, like maybe I was just another liar in their courtroom. Graves walked circles around me, waving transcripts from my time in Central, reading every lie I told to get inside. He made me explain how I faked the needle marks, how I practiced shaking like an addict, how I memorized street names for drugs I'd never touched. The prosecutor objected sometimes, but the damage kept piling up. During a break on day 2, families of the dead inmates crowded around me in the hallway. A father pressed a folder into my hands, filled with drawings his son made in high school before addiction took him. A sister played me a voicemail on her phone, her brother's voice saying he'd get clean soon, recorded 2 days before his death in cell block D. They needed the jury to understand these weren't just criminals who deserved whatever happened to them. They showed me birthday cards, report cards, photos from before prison. One mother kept repeating that her son was only 19 when Officer Sanchez marked another hash on his locker. Back in court on day 3, the prosecution finally got to play my wire recordings. The whole courtroom went silent as Sanchez's voice filled the room, laughing while Tommy seized on the concrete floor. You could hear Kent in the background taking $20 bets on whether the kid would last 5 more minutes. The recording caught everything. Davis's boots hitting my ribs with that wet thud sound, counting each kick out loud. Several jurors covered their mouths when they heard the storage room door slam and my breathing get ragged as Sanchez filled that syringe. The court reporter stopped typing twice to wipe her eyes. Even the bailiff looked away when the audio played Kent dragging someone down the hall while they begged for help. Blackwood took the stand next, wearing an expensive suit and talking about his decades of service. He claimed he never knew what happened in D Block, never saw the reports, never questioned why so many inmates died there. But Prosecutor Huang destroyed him with his own paperwork. She showed signature after signature on death certificates. 57 times he signed without ordering a single autopsy. She pulled up budget records showing he approved overtime for Sanchez and Kent every week they worked D Block. She read emails where he praised their efficient management of problem inmates. When she asked how he could sign 57 death certificates without asking questions, he just sat there with his mouth open. Tommy's mother Linda testified on week 33, her voice breaking as she described the hospital visit. The guards told her Tommy overdosed, that he chose drugs over getting clean, and she almost believed them. She talked about doubting her own son, wondering if she failed him, until I showed up at her door with the truth. She looked straight at Sanchez when she said the guards stole more than lives. They stole families' faith in their loved ones. The defense brought in Sanchez's teenage daughter as their last witness, trying to make him look human. She talked about soccer games and church picnics, about her dad helping with homework. But Huang only asked her one question on cross-examination about whether her father ever mentioned the storage room at work. The girl's confused face told the jury everything. Graves gave his closing argument the next month, spending 2 hours trying to reframe murder as tough choices in a broken system. He called the guards protectors pushed past their limits, dealing with violent criminals in an understaffed prison. He asked the jury to consider context, to understand pressure, to see these men as fathers and husbands doing impossible jobs, but his words felt hollow after weeks of evidence. Huang's closing hit harder than anything I'd seen in a courtroom. She put up photos of all 57 dead inmates, reading each name and age out loud. She played the audio of Sanchez saying "natural selection" over Tommy's convulsing body one more time. She reminded the jury these men got prison sentences, not death sentences. She used Sanchez's own words against him, Kent's tally marks, Davis's bragging about breaking ribs. The jury looked ready to convict before she even finished. They deliberated for 4 days that felt like 4 years. I stayed in a hotel near near the courthouse, unable to eat anything solid, checking my phone every 30 seconds for updates. Vasquez sat with me, fielding calls from FBI brass who wanted to know what was taking so long. Outside, news vans lined up like vultures, while legal experts on TV debated whether the guards would walk on technicalities. Families of victims held signs with their loved ones' faces, standing vigil in the cold. Carlos called me on day 3 of deliberations from his new office at the nonprofit he started. He said whatever happened with the verdict, we already changed things because D-Block would never operate the same way again. He was right about the change part, but I needed more than policy updates and new procedures. I needed those 57 names to mean something, needed Tommy's suffering to count, needed every broken rib and forced overdose to bring consequences. The call came on day 7 while I was staring at my phone in the FBI break room. The jury had reached verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. I drove to the courthouse with my hands shaking on the wheel, watching families of the dead inmates already gathering on the steps. The courtroom was packed when I walked in, every seat filled, people standing along the walls. Sanchez sat at the defense table in his suit, his jaw clenched tight, his fingers drumming on the wood. Kent looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to disappear. Davis kept cracking his knuckles over and over while Blackwood stared straight ahead at nothing. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then the jury filed in one by one, none of them looking at the defendants. The foreman handed the verdicts to the bailiff who passed them to the judge. She read through them silently first, her face giving nothing away, then cleared her throat. Sanchez, guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of racketeering. Kent, guilty on all 23 counts including murder, conspiracy, assault, and civil rights violations. Davis, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of aggravated assault. Blackwood, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of racketeering, guilty of dereliction of duty. The courtroom exploded with crying and shouting from the victims' families. Linda, whose son died in month 2, grabbed me in a hug so tight I couldn't breathe. But Sanchez turned in his chair and stared straight at me, mouthing words I could read clearly as they cuffed him. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and ordered presentence reports on all defendants. The defense attorneys immediately filed their motions, arguing their clients' military service, their years without prior incidents, their families who depended on them. Sanchez had 3 kids and his wife had cancer. Kent's father was a decorated cop who died in the line of duty. Davis had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Blackwood had 30 years of service with commendations. The prosecutors gathered victim impact statements from 57 families, each one detailing the hole left in their lives. I went back to the FBI office the next week, but nothing felt the same anymore. Agents I'd worked with for years looked at me differently, some nodding with respect, others avoiding eye contact completely. My supervisor called me in and suggested maybe I should transfer to Financial Crimes Division. He said it would be less intense, give me time to decompress, but how do you go from hunting killers to tracking spreadsheets? The looks followed me everywhere, whispers in the break room, conversations that stopped when I walked by. This verdict reading scene is pure justice finally happening. Watching Sanchez get hit with first-degree murder charges after all his natural selection talk must feel so good for the families. 3 weeks after the verdict, a letter arrived at the office with Tommy's name on the return address. His handwriting was neat and careful, nothing like the shaking kid I'd watched seize on that cell floor. He'd been clean 6 months, enrolled in welding school, had a girlfriend named Sarah who didn't know about his past yet. He sent a photo from his rehab graduation, standing between his parents, all of them smiling real smiles. He looked 20 pounds heavier, his skin clear, his eyes actually focused on the camera. The letter said he woke up grateful every morning, that I'd saved his life, but I couldn't stop seeing him convulsing while Kent watched. A month later, my supervisor made the PTSD evaluation mandatory after I jumped when someone dropped a tray in the cafeteria. Dr. Brennan ran through her checklist while I sat in her office trying not to fidget. The nightmares, check. The constant checking over my shoulder, check. The inability to feel anything when my sister told me she was pregnant, check. She wrote me prescriptions for pills I didn't want to take and scheduled therapy I didn't want to attend. 2 weeks before sentencing, Carlos called at 2 a.m., his voice shaking. A car had tried to run him down outside his apartment, missed him by inches, took out a mailbox instead. The driver had a brother in the prison guard union, worked at a facility upstate, had been asking around about witness addresses. The FBI put security on Carlos and every other witness, but we all knew it was just for show. The system had tentacles everywhere, guards who knew people willing to do favors. Maria testified at the medical board hearing the same week, bringing boxes of documents she'd secretly copied over 2 years. She showed how the medical director ignored her reports about suspicious deaths, how he destroyed paperwork, how he threatened to have her nursing license revoked. The board suspended him immediately pending investigation, another domino falling, but Maria had to move in with her sister after getting death threats. I started going to a support group for law enforcement PTSD on Wednesday nights in a church basement. Other undercover agents sat in the circle, guys who'd infiltrated biker gangs, cartels, domestic terror cells. One agent who'd spent 3 years with the mob said the hardest part wasn't the danger, but coming back to normal life after. laughter. We all nodded because we got it. The way you forget who you really are. The way you can't trust anyone anymore. The media went crazy the week before sentencing. Documentary crews camping outside the courthouse. Publishers sending book offers to my FBI email. Kent's wife went on every morning show that would have her, crying about how her husband was a scapegoat, how the real criminals were the inmates. She started a GoFundMe that raised $50,000 before the site shut it down, then started another one that raised $30,000 more. My mother drove down from Sacramento with containers of food I couldn't eat and hugs I didn't know how to accept. She sat at my kitchen table showing me screenshots of messages people had sent her Facebook, threats against her, against me, against our whole family. She'd been keeping them from me for weeks, filing police reports that went nowhere, changing her phone number twice. She stayed for 3 days, sleeping on my couch and jumping every time a car drove by, before I finally convinced her to go back home where it was safer. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearings started. The courthouse was packed with families of the 57 victims, reporters, and protesters holding signs demanding justice. I sat in the witness section, watching mothers clutch photos of their dead sons. The first mother to speak could barely stand, her husband holding her up as she approached the microphone. She described going to the morgue to identify her son's body, how she'd spent months hating herself for not visiting him more, for believing he'd relapsed when the guards called to say he'd overdosed. Her voice cracked when she said she'd thrown away his last letter unopened because she thought he was just asking for drug money. A father went next, talking about how he'd ignored his daughter's last phone call from Central because the guards had told him she was high again and manipulating him for commissary money. He'd found out later she was calling to tell him she loved him, scared because other inmates kept dying around her. More families followed, each story worse than the last. Parents who'd been told their kids were junkies beyond help when really they were being murdered. Siblings who'd stopped taking calls because guards said the inmates were just trying to score drugs. The guards hadn't just killed these people, they'd poisoned their families' last memories of them. Tommy took the stand next, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone. He talked about waking up screaming every night, seeing Officer Sanchez's face when he closed his eyes. He couldn't walk past anyone in uniform without his heart racing. He'd tried to go back to school, but had a panic attack when the security guard approached him. The defense attorneys looked down at their papers while he described how dying would have been easier than living with what they'd done to him. When it was Sanchez's turn to speak, he stood up straight and looked right at the families. He didn't apologize or show any emotion. He said he'd protected society from animals who deserved what they got. The judge's face went hard as stone. She read out 57 counts of murder, each one carrying life without parole, sentences to run consecutively. As the bailiffs dragged him away, he screamed at me that I was the real criminal, that I'd destroyed good men doing their jobs. Kent broke down crying during his statement, claiming Sanchez had corrupted him, that he was just following orders. The judge cut him off, telling him he'd had 57 chances to stop and chose not to. She gave him 40 years to life. Davis got 25 years, his lawyer arguing he was just muscle who didn't make decisions. Blackwood got 30 years for conspiracy, the judge noting that as warden, he'd created the environment where murder became routine. Some families cheered when the sentences were read. Others just sat there crying because no amount of prison time would bring their loved ones back. Outside the courthouse afterward, a woman grabbed my arm. It was Linda, Tommy's mother. She said it wasn't enough, but it was something, then told me Tommy wanted to become an addiction counselor to help people who'd been where he was. She kept thanking me for saving him, but all I could think about was the 57 who didn't make it out. That night, Agent Vasquez called with news from headquarters. They wanted to promote me to lead a new task force investigating institutional abuse nationwide. More undercover work, more danger, more time pretending to be someone else. She gave me a week to decide. Part of me wanted to keep fighting, to stop this from happening in other prisons. Part of me didn't know if I had anything left to give. Carlos had started a nonprofit by then, using our case to push for prison reform. He got invited to testify before Congress, 3 senators already pledging support for new oversight legislation. He called me from DCE. Change was slow, but it was happening. Then the real bombshell dropped. An internal FBI review found that reports about unusual deaths at Central had been filed 2 years before my operation. Some analyst had noticed the pattern, written it up, sent it through proper channels. It sat on someone's desk for 18 months before being marked low priority. The Bureau had known something was wrong and hadn't acted until the body count was undeniable. I met with the FBI director himself about it, sitting in his office while he gave me bureaucratic excuses about resource allocation and competing priorities. When I pushed him, he actually said those men were convicted criminals, as if that made their murders acceptable. The same indifference that let the guards kill with impunity existed all the way up the chain. I started seeing Dr. Brennan twice a week after that revelation. She kept telling me I couldn't carry responsibility for decisions made before I knew about them, but knowing those reports existed, that someone had seen the pattern and done nothing, added another layer to everything. The system that should have protected those men had failed at every level. The guards killed them, the warden enabled it, and the FBI ignored the warning signs until it was too late. A month later, my phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. The photo showed him in a yellow hard hat and work boots. suits, standing next to electrical equipment at a construction site. His message said he'd been clean 10 months and just graduated from trade school. I stared at that photo for 20 minutes, remembering the kid who'd been seizing on the cell floor while guards took bets. Now he was building things instead of destroying himself. The prison guard union filed their appeal the next week, hiring some fancy law firm from Los Angeles. They claimed the trial was rigged, that we'd planted evidence, that the whole thing was a setup. Their lawyers started flooding the courts with motions and demands for new hearings. Carlos called to tell me they were also fighting his reform bill, spending millions to protect the system that let 57 men die. Then everything went to hell when someone leaked my undercover photos online. I woke up to hundreds of notifications on my phone, my real name trending on social media. Within 3 hours, my address was posted on revenge forums, along with my mom's phone number and my ex-girlfriend's workplace. The FBI's tech team tried to scrub it, but screenshots spread faster than they could delete them. My handler called within minutes, telling me to pack a bag and get out immediately. Tommy's transformation from that dying kid to standing proud in construction gear is making my heart burst. 10 months clean, trade school graduate, building instead of destroying. This photo showing him in that hard hat hits different after everything. Mom had to leave her apartment that same day when people started showing up taking photos. The Bureau moved us both to safe houses while they figured out witness protection options. Central State announced new policies the following week with cameras in every corner and federal oversight teams. Carlos attended the reform meeting and texted me updates about the new rules they were implementing. But he also told me the guards had already found blind spots in the camera coverage. They weren't killing people anymore, but the beatings continued in places cameras couldn't see. The cruelty just got smarter, more careful, harder to prove. 3 weeks later, some families invited me to visit the graves of victims. I drove out to Riverside Memorial Cemetery on a cloudy Tuesday morning, finding rows of headstones I'd only known as case numbers. Miguel's mother met me at his grave, a simple stone marker with his name and dates. She took my hand and said, at least now they knew the truth about how he died. She didn't blame me for surviving when her son didn't. But standing there looking at all those graves, I blamed myself. Each headstone was someone who died while I was gathering evidence, someone I couldn't save. The weight of being the one who lived felt heavier than anything I'd carried undercover. Sanchez's appeal hearing came 2 months later, and his new lawyer tried a different angle. He showed the court photos of the syringes from the storage room, claiming I'd planted them there myself. He said the FBI had set up the whole operation to frame innocent guards doing a tough job. The theory was crazy, but it played well on conspiracy websites where people already distrusted the government. I had to testify again, sitting in that courtroom while Sanchez smirked at me from the defense table. His lawyer grilled me for 3 hours about every detail, trying to find inconsistencies in my story. The wire recordings saved me, playing Sanchez's own voice talking about cleaning up the streets one junkie at a time. But the damage was done because now half the internet thought maybe he was innocent. The judge took a week to rule, finally dismissing the appeal as completely without merit. But by then, the conspiracy theories had taken hold online, with whole forums dedicated to proving FBI entrapment. Death threats started showing up at the Bureau, at my mom's new address that somehow got leaked again, even at my old gym. Mom had to move for the 3rd time in 4 months, while I started carrying a gun everywhere. We won in court, but lost in the court of public opinion, where truth didn't matter as much as what people wanted to believe. The FBI offered me a promotion to lead a new undercover unit, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't put on another fake identity, couldn't pretend to be someone else while real people died around me. Instead, I requested a transfer to the training academy, where I could teach new agents what I'd learned. It wasn't the career path I'd planned, but at least I could help without losing more pieces of myself. Carlos organized a memorial service for all 57 victims, 14 months after the arrests. Families came from all over California to remember their sons and brothers and fathers as people, not just statistics. Tommy spoke about surviving when others didn't. I talked about the courage it took to seek justice, and Maria told everyone about the truth finally coming to light. The service was held at a community center near the prison, with photos of every victim displayed on tables with candles. We read their names out loud, all 57 of them, giving them the dignity they'd been denied in death. After the formal service ended, families mingled and shared stories about who their loved ones had been before prison. A man approached me near the end, introducing himself as the brother of victim number 32. He shook my hand and thanked me for being the one who lived to tell what happened. His forgiveness for my survival broke something inside me that I'd been holding together for over a year. I started crying right there in front of everyone, tears I'd been holding back since the day the FBI pulled me out. I cried for the 57 men who died horrible deaths, for Tommy who almost became number 58, for Carlos who had to watch it all happen. I cried for their families who would never get them back. And finally, I cried for myself, for the part of me that died in that prison, even though my body survived. 3 weeks later, the Department of Justice held a press conference announcing they were launching a nationwide review of prison deaths in 30 facilities across the country. Carlos sat next to me in the federal building watching the announcement on the big screen, his hands shaking as the Attorney General General read statistics about suspicious deaths in custody. The investigation our case sparked would examine over 300 deaths that had been ruled suicides or overdoses in the past 5 years. Carlos grabbed my arm when they mentioned the 57 names from D Block would be the foundation for new oversight protocols. Month 14. Into the legal proceedings, Tommy called me from his job at the construction site where he'd been working steady for 8 months. His voice cracked when he told me his girlfriend was pregnant and asked if I'd be the godfather to their baby. The kid who'd been seizing on that cell floor while guards planted drugs on him was now building a family and a future. 6 months after that, I started teaching at Quantico, standing in front of 23 new agents and showing them the actual wire from my shoes that recorded everything in D Block. I walked them through each day inside, explaining how to document atrocities when you can't stop them from happening, how to survive when your cover is all that keeps you alive. The tremors in my hands were real now, not faked like they'd been going in, and the agents noticed but didn't say anything. During the appeals process, Kent finally broke completely and gave the FBI everything about similar operations in Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. His testimony led to 17 more arrests of guards who'd been forcing overdoses on inmates for years. The prosecutor offered him 25 years instead of life in exchange for the names and locations of every guard involved in the network. Dr. Brennan adjusted my medication again during our session, explaining that the PTSD would never fully go away, but we could manage it enough for me to function. The nightmares came less often, but they never stopped completely, and certain sounds like metal doors slamming would send me right back to D Block. Linda sent me photos from Tommy's wedding 2 years after the raid, him standing at the altar clean and healthy with his pregnant wife beside him. In his speech, he thanked the guardian angel who saved his life without naming me directly, just saying someone gave him a second chance when the system wanted him dead. The reform legislation took 3 years to pass, but when it did, they called it the D Block Act, mandating federal oversight of all state prisons and independent investigation of any death in custody. Carlos testified at the signing ceremony, standing at the podium and reading all 57 names while senators and representatives sat in silence. On the 2-year anniversary of the raid, Carlos and I got permission to visit Central together, walking through D Block with federal monitors who showed us the new cameras in every cell and the medical staff stationed on each floor. The cells still smelled like fear, though, and when I looked in the eyes of the current inmates, I saw the same terror I'd felt, because systems change on paper faster than they change in practice. I sat with a group of current D Block inmates in the rec room, telling them about the investigation and the convictions while they listened with a mix of hope and skepticism. One younger inmate asked why I risked my life for people society had thrown away, and I thought about Tommy's seizure and Carlos's warnings and those 57 names before telling him someone had to survive to tell the truth. 3 days after that visit, I got a letter forwarded through the FBI from an inmate in Arkansas whose guards were showing the same patterns of mysterious deaths and targeting vulnerable inmates with no families. He'd hidden evidence in his cell and was waiting for someone to believe him, someone to listen before he became another suicide statistic. I forwarded everything to my old team and called Carlos to tell him the fight wasn't over, that everything we'd exposed in D Block was happening in other prisons right now. The 57 names from Central had taught us the most important lesson of all, that somebody has to survive to tell the truth, and now we knew how to make sure somebody always would. Wow, that was such a fun ride. Seriously, thanks for hanging out and sharing all the excitement with me. I'm already looking forward to next time. Subscribe for more content like this.